Hello. Today I'm going to be talking about how to make a graph from data that's entered into a Google Sheet. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen right here. Perfect. So this is the wonderful world of graphs, how to create and interpret a graph based on different types of data that you might collect. So the objectives for today, we're going to review the 3 common types of data collection, or at least 3 that I typically recommend. You might be collecting data in a lot of different ways, but these are 3 that I'll just go through because it gives you kind of an idea of the different types of ways that you can create graphs for behavior or for behavior goals or both. We're going to understand, or I'll talk about how to interpret a graph based on the level, trend, and variability within the data that you can see. And then I'll use examples based on the 3 types of data collection to walk you through the different steps of how to enter the data and create graphs, and then also how to interpret those graphs once all of that data is in there. So bear with me. It's going to be really helpful in the long run to be able to do this and use graphs at IEP meetings or in talking with staff about behavior plans and behavior change. So yeah, it's really great. The first thing that I want to talk about is why we collect data. This is a quote from a textbook that I used in my graduate studies, but I really liked this line that says, without data, we are left vulnerable to committing 2 kinds of preventable mistakes. A, continuing an ineffective treatment when no real behavior change has occurred, or B, discontinuing an effective treatment because subjective judgment detects no improvement. So anytime I get feedback from staff that an intervention isn't working, the first thing that I want to do is look at the data. What is the graph telling me? Is this something that isn't effective and we do need to tweak a little bit, or is it something that maybe is making minor changes and we just need to stay the course in order to reach that long-term goal? So in order to get started with data collection, we need to determine which behavior or behaviors we want to target. The only thing with targeting those behaviors is that not only do they need to have a name, but they also need to have a definition. So it needs to be observable and measurable, very clear and objective, so that anyone who is observing the student can identify that same behavior. You'll also need to figure out what type of data you want to collect. It might be frequency, which would be the number of times. It could be per hour, per day, per week. The duration, how long the behavior lasts, per minute or per instance or per day or per week, so you can get some totals there as well. You might also want to track goal progress. And so you would have some predetermined scoring criteria to quantify that progress, and then you can use that to create a graph as well. There might be other types of data that you would want to collect too, but these are the 3 that I'm going to focus on today. So the 3 types of data collection methods that I'm going to talk about in relation to graphing are ABC charts, partial interval forms, and point sheets. ABC charts, I'm going to show you examples and kind of walk you through where all of that information is. But through that chart, you can get the frequency, how many times problem behaviors are happening during the day, and then also the total duration per day. So on these forms, staff document start times and end times. You can convert that to minutes, total it up, and you have the total minutes per day. The partial interval form also gives you a very minimum frequency. With that form, staff just circle yes or no during an interval if a behavior happened at all. So it could have happened 5 times, it could have happened once. So that's where you get that minimum frequency in the partial interval form. You can also use it for goal tracking, whether or not maybe a replacement behavior was demonstrated or a new skill was practiced. That's another way you can use that type of form. And then the third one is a point sheet. And with the point sheet, that's really where we want to target goal tracking and seeing, are they meeting criteria for what we're trying to teach them and help them practice throughout the day. So the first example This is an example of an ABC checkbox sheet. It's one that I typically share out when I'm doing consultation work in different programs. And what I like about this form is that you can collect information on all of the behavior incidents per day on this form, and it's primarily checkbox. So in the first column, you would fill in the date. The second column is the duration. So staff would track start time and end time. That's where you get your total minutes. And then they would just check the boxes that applied for antecedent, behavior, and consequence. So in the kind of teal boxes, I did point out where you would get the duration in minutes. That's counting all of the minutes from the start time and end time for that day. Then you get your total duration for the day. And then the frequency would just be the number of incidents tracked that day. So if it was 410, you would just count all of the incidents that happened on 410. That's your frequency, and then total up those minutes of duration. The green box is information that's helpful for FBAs and BIPs to pinpoint, what are some common antecedents or triggers for the problem behavior? How are staffing responding to the behavior? And what behaviors are we seeing most frequently during these instances? So that's where this form can come in handy. But the information that we'll graph are from those boxes that are highlighted in that blue teal color. The second form is a partial interval form. So in this form, you'll have the student's initials, the date, the instructions, and that would be circle yes or Y if the target behavior occurred at any time during the interval, and then circle N or no if the behavior did not occur at all. So it's kind of like it either happened or it didn't. The target behaviors, you want to make sure that you have a label for them and that they are clearly defined. So these are just examples that I pulled. The first one is verbal disruption. The second one is elopement. Then you'll have the 3 columns. So the time frame or activity. So you'll fill in the time and then what the activity is. That information is going to be helpful again for FBAs or BIPs to show correlations between time of day or activity or people who are present. You can get all of that information just from looking at that schedule and knowing kind of what is going on in that student's day. The other 2 columns are whether or not those target behaviors occurred. So the yes would indicate that the behavior occurred, N would indicate the behavior did not. At the very bottom, that blue teal box, that is the information that you will get, that you will take to put into the graph. So again, all of this is tracked throughout the day, but the only information you use for the graph are those total percentages at the bottom. How many intervals were marked yes divided by the total number of intervals tracked gives you a percentage, and that percentage is what you're going to enter into your Google Sheet. The third type of data collection is a behavior goal sheet or a point sheet. So again, the time and activity is helpful for FBAs and BIPs. The very bottom has the definitions of the behavior goals and then scoring criteria. And then that blue teal box, again, that's where you're going to calculate the percentage. And then that percentage is what you will graph for each behavior goal. And then you might also want to graph the total percentage for that day. Before we jump into how to read the graphs, I'll walk you through the different parts of the graph. So there's the title will be up in the top left. You can change that positioning once you've got the graph set up. The y-axis here, that's the dependent variable. So that's going to be the measure of the behavior, whether it's frequency, duration, both, the percentage, all of that will be graphed on this y-axis. And then down at the very bottom, that's the x-axis. That's going to be your measurement of time. Typically, it's going to be the date. And then you've got your graph on there. So there are 3 different ways that we look at graphs in order to interpret the information that they're presenting to us. The first part is the level, and that's kind of where the data falls on the graph. So the yellow line has a high level, the red line is more that mid-level, and then the blue line is a low level. And so when we're talking about the level, that's what we're referring to. It can be low, mid, or high. We'll also look at the trend. Is the trend increasing? Like in this example, is it going up? Or is the trend decreasing? And then there's that example. Depending on the behavior that we're tracking, we might want to see it increasing, especially if we're looking at a behavior goal. Or if we're looking at problem behavior, we would want to see a decreasing trend in the frequency and duration of those behaviors. And then there's variability. So variability is kind of the difference between the data points. If there's low variability, there's not much difference between all of the data points. That means that there's more consistency in the behavior. It's going to kind of stay around that level. Whereas if there's high variability, there's less consistency in the behavior because there's more room between each of the data points. They vary a lot more than the other graph. And so this is an example of a high variability graph. The behavior is less stable there, and so it's hard to tell whether or not the intervention is actually working if there's a lot of variability there. So now that we talked about the different data collection forms, and then the 3 ways to interpret graphs through level, trend, and variability, we're going to start talking about the way that we put these graphs together. I'm going to start with the ABC data graph. So the information that you need in order to start your Google Sheet will be the date, the frequency, so the number of instances per day that problem behavior occurred, and then the duration, that total amount of time that the student spent engaged in problem behavior. And that would be in minutes that the problem behavior occurred. A few things to remember before you start your graph and as you're entering the data. If there's information missing, like a start time or an end time, try to follow up with the staff who collected the data so that you can get that information. If you're not able to get that information, you simply would leave that date blank on the spreadsheet and you would not enter that data. The reason why is because we want to make sure that we're not skewing the data. So if there isn't any information, don't just put a 0 because then that's going to impact your trend line and likely also your variability. If the student is absent, you simply don't put that date into the spreadsheet. Again, do not enter 0 because that will skew your data on your graph. Before I click on the link, I will walk you through the instructions and then I'll show you how to create the graph. And just as a side note, I did put the Google Sheet that has all of the information or the data already entered in the folder so that you can access it. And if you'd like to follow along while I'm showing you how to create those graphs, you can do that as well. So entering data. Here you're taking the frequency and duration from those ABC charts and putting it into a Google Sheet. The first thing you're going to do is open a new Google Sheet spreadsheet. And then I kind of walk you through how to do that there. You're going to enter the title, which is at the top left. And then column A is date. Before you do anything else, you're going to want to change date from number to plain text. And the reason why is because students don't go to school 7 days a week, 365 days a year. And using plain text, we'll still put the date at the bottom, but it won't leave any weird gaps in your data collection, which can be helpful to see a more cohesive graph. So the way that you change that to plain text is you select all of column A. There's usually a little arrow on the left or the right side of that box. And then you go to format up here and then number under that drop-down box. And then you'll click on plain text. And then that will change the date to plain text so that it doesn't mess up your graph. Column B is frequency, and then column C is duration. Once you have all of those labels in there, you can enter away. Get all that info in there. So to create a graph, you're going to highlight all 3 columns in that spreadsheet that you just entered, and then you'll click on Insert Chart. So Insert is again at the top, and then once that drop-down box comes down, you'll click on Chart. Typically, it will automatically create a line graph, but in the event that it doesn't, just make sure that it's a line chart, and I will show you where you can find that. And then you will select the graph, and then there will be 3 dots that pop up in the top right corner. You're going to click on those and select Move to Own Sheet. And so that way it'll be separate from your data sheet. which again, I will show you how to do that as well. And then once it is in its own sheet, it's going to say chart 1 or chart 2 in the tabs at the very bottom of that worksheet. And so you'll click on the chart tab or right click on it, click rename, and then type in the name for that graph. So I will go ahead and click on my sample data. All right, so I have all 3 data sets in this Google Sheet. So I'm going to go to the behavior data, which has the date, the frequency, and the duration. So in order to make the graph, I'm going to highlight all 3 columns all the way down to that last data point. Go to Insert, Chart, and then a chart comes up. Now you'll see that it gave me a stacked column chart. So the way that you would change that is to, under chart type, under setup, you're going to click that drop down box and click line. So now I turned it into a line chart. And then I will move this to its own sheet before I start editing it. So I clicked on those 3 dots in the top right. I'll click on move to own sheet, and there you go. I'm going to rename it. So right now it says chart 3. I'm going to rename to behavior graph. And then I can go ahead and start playing around with it. The first thing I'll do is change the title. I'm going to change it to student behavior graph. And then we are ready to start interpreting it. The one thing I do want to point out is at the very bottom, where you see the dates listed, there's an asterisk next to 3/9/20. That to me is denoting that that's when the intervention was introduced. So if we go back to that lovely PowerPoint that I have here, we'll look at interpreting the graph. So this is just a copy of the graph we just made. And I put this line in there. The one thing that's really tricky with Google Sheets that I still haven't quite figured out is putting in a phase change line. So you do want to have some baseline data to determine, to compare back to once you put the intervention in to see if it's actually effective. I drew this line once I copied and pasted the chart out of there. So this is showing that between 3.6 and 3.9, that's when we put in that intervention. So really, the 3.6 and 3.9 data points ideally would not be connected. There's not a way to disconnect that at this time in Google Sheets. So if you're talking to a parent and showing them this was the baseline, then we implemented the behavior plan, you might just want to put an asterisk by that date that you started it so that you can show, yep, the behavior was pretty high in duration before we put in the behavior intervention plan, and then the duration dropped significantly and stayed relatively low or continued to decrease once we put the intervention in place. So when we're comparing from baseline to intervention, we're going to look at the level. Here, the duration was at a pretty high level, and it dropped to a much lower level, maybe mid to low, once the intervention was in place. The trend, if you just look at the 5 data points that we have in the baseline, the trend line would be kind of flat, I would say. But then once the intervention is in place, it would be a decreasing trend line. And then we'll look at the variability. There was a little bit more variability during baseline than there is during intervention. There was one spike here on, looks like, the 3rd, and that could be attributed to, the end of the week. It could be attributed to the student not taking medication that helps regulate them, or it could just be kind of a blip and the behavior came back for that day, but then staff continued with the plan and the behavior decreased. So what's nice about these graphs is that you are able to say, yep, this 4-3 was a really rough day. Here are some things that happened. Here are some things that we did about it. And then we were able to get some more stability through the behavior data, or we can see the stability on the graph based on the plan. So I believe that covers all of that. So that's the behavior graph. Now I'll walk you through the partial interval form. So the information that you need from this form is the date and then the percent of intervals that the behavior occurred for each behavior. So on the form that I showed you, there were 2 different behaviors on there. You're going to want the percentage of each percent occurrence of each behavior. Some things to remember when graphing the percentage from, or calculating the percentage from the partial interval form is if an interval was not marked that day, it should not count towards the total number of intervals. So for example, if 12 of 13 intervals were marked and one was just left blank, then it would be the total number of intervals marked divided by 12 rather than the full 13. If less than half of the intervals were marked, say it was just a really tough day and staff didn't get around to collecting that data, you would either enter it and then make a note with an asterisk or some other way to show you, hey, you know, this was a lot smaller sample size as far as the intervals go. Or, oh yeah, in order to let you know that very little data was collected that day. So when you're entering the data from the partial interval data sheet, you can either create a new data sheet or a new Google sheet that I put the instructions in here for you, or you can add a new sheet to the same document, and that's just this little plus sign here. You'll add a new page to that same sheet. So once you've decided whether you're going to do a new one or just add to the one that you've already started, you're going to type date under column A. Again, make sure that that is plain text. So I have those instructions in there. And then column B is going to be percent intervals of target behavior 1. Here it's percent intervals of verbal disruption. And then column C is going to be the percent intervals of target behavior 2. Here it's percent of the intervals that elopement occurred. And then you would enter away. Start with those percentages. So when we're creating the graph, it's the same steps that you would follow for the ABC data sheet. So you're going to highlight all 3 columns, click on Insert, and then when the drop-down box comes down, you'll click on Chart, make sure it's a line chart. Then you'll select the graph, click on those 3 vertical dots at the top right, select Move to Own Sheet, and then make sure that you rename that chart once it's on its own sheet. We'll look here. Now I will graph the partial interval data. Okay, so I select all 3 columns and all of the data that's entered. Then I go up to Insert. I click Chart. And it made a line graph for me this time. So then I'll click those 3 dots in the top right. I'm going to move to Own Sheet, and then I'll rename that sheet Partial Interval Graph. I might want to update the title too, so I'll double click on that. Interval graph, however you want to name that. And then we can move on to interpreting the graph. Okay. So again, I put in the phase change line just so that you can see the difference between baseline and intervention. But again, when we're comparing the level, trend, and variability from baseline to intervention, we can see here that there was an increasing trend. They were both at relatively high levels, and there was minor variability, not a ton. And then once the intervention was put in place, the level dropped, the trend line is decreasing, and there's less variability in that data. There again is a spike on 4.3. And that was just to give an example of what maybe a more difficult day would look like for a student, because there's not always going to be just that pretty decreasing trend line. There might be some days that are more difficult than others. So that's important to consider when we're looking at graphs too. All right, and then point sheet graph. So the information that you need in order to enter the data into the Google Sheet is the date, and then the percent of points earned for each goal and or the total points percentage. So depending on what information you want to relay, you might just graph each goal separately, you might just graph the total, or you might graph all of it. And the graph that I will show you will have all of the information, but you'll see once I pull it up, it can be tough to really parse out what you're looking at as far as the information with 4 different lines on that graph. So you might want to break it up into separate graphs, and I'll show you how to do that as well. A few things to remember: if an interval was not marked, do not count the points for that interval toward the total for that day. So again, similar to the partial interval example, if 12 of the 13 intervals were marked, the total possible points that the student could earn that day would be 36 instead of 39. So that's how you'll calculate your percentage. If less than half of the intervals are marked for that day, make a note, again, either with an asterisk or some other way to denote that there was little data collected that day. When you're entering the data here, there's a lot more information on this one. Again, you can just add another sheet to the worksheet that you're already using. You'll type date under column A, goal behavior 1 under column B, here it's follow directions. Goal behavior 2 under column C, here we have safe body. Goal number 3 under column D, which is kind words and actions. And then I also did add under column E the total percentage. So that's everything totaled up and calculated for the entire day as far as what points they earned. Then you enter away, start putting in all of your percentages. To create this graph, it's the same process. You'll just highlight all 5 columns up to the last data entry. Click on Insert Chart, make sure it's a line chart, and then move that graph to its own sheet and rename the sheet. I will show you this one. All right, and see how I did put an asterisk on 3-9, and then in column F, I just put intervention started to let myself know that this is when we started maybe the behavior plan or whatever strategies we're using to support the student. So to create the graph, I'm going to select all 5 columns all the way down to the bottom, click Insert, Chart, and then here's your pretty line chart. I'll move it to its own sheet, and I will rename it. First point sheet graph. Might change the title as well. Point sheet graph, keep it really simple. So as you can see here, we've got 4 different lines. The nice thing is that it'll automatically make them different colors, so that's helpful, but it is a lot to look at, especially when there's a lot of similarity between the data points. So that's why sometimes it can be helpful to break it down and create individual graphs for each section, and that's really, really fast. So I'll show you how to do that. First, we will practice interpreting the graph. So again, I put in that phase change line for you, but here we can see that the baseline percentages were more in that mid level. The trend was pretty flatlined. If you drew trend lines there, maybe slightly decreasing. And then there was not a ton of variability, maybe a tiny bit, but not very much. Once we put in the intervention, the level did jump up a little bit, and then it stays in that higher level range. The trend line looks like it would be increasing, and then the variability, there's a lot less variability in this data that's been collected, with the exception of that one day. That was a rough day where the percentages dropped, and then they continued to increase after that. So that concludes how to create the graphs after you enter all of the data. There are a couple things that I want to point out with graphs because it's not going to be perfect the way that you want to present it when you create the graph initially. So in order to make changes, You'll select the graph that you're going to be working on, and then look for the chart editor. So I took a screenshot of that. It's going to show up on the right-hand side. And under Customize, that's where you can select all the different parts of the graph that you would want to change, whether it's a font, style, color, size, the different titles of all of the axes. You can change the lines as well. You can make them thinner or thicker under the series. You can also add in points for the data so that you can actually see the data points on there. You can move the legend and play around with the size and location of that. You can modify the horizontal axis, the vertical axis, set minimums and maximums, things like that. And then you can play around with the grid lines as well. One of the things I do like to do is move that legend. I don't like it right at the top, so I'll either move it to the bottom of the graph or I'll move it on to the right-hand side. But under legend, so this is what the drop-down box looks like with all of the different options. You can change the position, you can change the font, you can change the size, and then do a couple other fun things with it too. So I will walk you through some of those changes really quick. Let's get the behavior graph up here. So I'm going to click on the graph, and then under Customize, I'm going to move the legend. So I'll click on Legend, and under Position, I'm going to click Bottom because I want it underneath everything. Let's see. And then I can also change. So if I do series, maybe on all series, I do want the points to be circles. So I'm going to add in the circle points. And then you can change the size. So maybe those are too big. I'll change them to 7. And then the line thickness, you can change that as well. So there are lots of different things you can do to better represent the data that you're trying to show in the graphs. All right. The next thing I want to talk about is graphing one set of data. So we're going to revisit that behavior data graph. As you can see, the duration is taking up most of the space on the graph because the duration is graphed in minutes. So there might be longer behaviors during that day, and the instances, the number of behaviors they have might be relatively low because it might last longer than it occurs during the day. So we've got them both graphed on the same y-axis, which makes it kind of difficult to see how many times per day the behavior is happening. So there are 2 ways that you can fix this. One allows you to create a second y-axis to depict the frequency. But I find this kind of difficult to read, and it can be confusing, especially if you're showing it to a parent. So this is the example. The duration, again, is on the left, but then on the right, it's the frequency. So you can see it goes from 0 to 10 instead of 0 to 150, and then the frequency does kind of match the duration as far as like the variability, trend, level, things like that. So if this is something that you're interested in doing, you absolutely can. I can show you where that is. But the way that I like to do it, because again, it's a lot cleaner, a lot more clear cut, is pulling out the data and graphing, making one graph that's just the frequency per day and one graph that's just duration per day. So I walk you through. It's the very same process for creating graphs. It's just that you're going to select and highlight the date and frequency columns, create a graph through that. And then since there's the frequency in between the date and duration columns, you'll highlight the date column first, and then hold the control button and highlight the duration column, and then click insert chart, and then so forth. You can also do this with the behavior goal graph or that points sheet data that has the 4 different lines on it to separate those out. So I will show you how to do that. So this is our behavior graph that has the duration and frequency both graphed on the same axis. If I go back to the behavior data, actually, let me go back to the graph first. So the way that you would change the axis is under series, frequency. You will Under axis, click right axis, and then that changes it so that the values for the frequency are on the left or on the right. I'm sorry. And then the duration in minutes is on the left. I'm going to go ahead and change that back though. And then I will show you how to do the two individual graphs. So we'll highlight date and frequency and then click Insert Chart. There's your beautiful frequency line chart. And then I'll move that out of the way. And then we'll highlight date. I'm going to hold down the control button, highlight duration, and then click Insert Chart. And there's your duration graph. Again, you can change. So if you like to have duration in red, and it's helpful to just remember duration is always in red, you can select that series and then change the color to red. So that way you can have them still be those different colors, but on different graphs. You can move those to their own sheet, or you can copy and paste them into one like Google Doc so that you can print them out and look at them side by side. All right. And finally, trend lines. So when you want to put a trend line in, you're going to select the graph, go to that chart editor on the right. Under Customize, you'll select Series. So that's what this screenshot is up here. If you want a trend line for a specific series, you'll click on this drop-down box and select the one that you want. But if you want, you can also apply it to all series. And then you'll just check the trend line box and the trend lines will come up. The cool thing is that the trend line will match the color of the graph line. It'll just be a little bit faded. So again, you can see which trend line goes with which set of data. I will walk you through how to create a trend line. So let's go to the point sheet graph. So in here, I'm going to select the graph under Customize. I'll go to Series, click on that drop-down box. I'll apply it to all series. And so I'll just click Trend Line. And then you can see I have a red, a green, a blue, and a yellow trend line. So that's helpful. And they're all trending up, which is great. Same thing for the behavior graph. We've got the trend line there. And then the partial interval graph, we can also click and insert the trend lines there. So series, well, maybe we will just do it for elopement so you can see what it looks like with one. So this is just the trend line for the percent of intervals that elopement is occurring during the day. All right, so I think that I have covered everything. I know that was a lot of information. Feel free to play around with the sample Google Sheet that I did put in the folder and reach out with any questions that you have, or if you have data that you're collecting in a different way that you'd like to create a graph for, I am happy to help with any of that. So go ahead and send me an email if you do have any questions. Otherwise, thank you very much, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of the year and a great summer. Thank you.